Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome to this episode of Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is Dr. Anthony Biglan, behavioural scientist and clinical psychologist. And we're talking about his book, The Nurture Effect, how the science of human behaviour can improve our lives and our world. This is, in some sense, a memoir of 40 years of work, exceptional work, looking at how behavioural science not only has changed the world, but continues to change the world in pro-social ways that we can be involved in doing so in our local communities. A very exciting episode, something that is very interesting and dear to me, and really continues to speak along the same lines as the works of Stephen Hayes and David Sloan Wilson. So without any further ado, please welcome Tony Biglan. Anthony, a very warm welcome and a big thank you for coming onto the show. Really looking forward to talking about the nature effect. I know that being a behavioural scientist, you've got a lot to talk about in this space, but more so, the excitement that brings me forward is having spoken with David Sloan Wilson and Stephen C. Hayes, who do some incredible work, and to have someone on like yourself again is just another exciting moment for me. So thank you for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit about, if we just get straight stuck into the book, The Nature Effect, and how it's come about, really.
Well, let's see. I'm 76 years old, and I haven't retired because it's just gotten interesting. I've been, in my career, the degree to which behavioral sciences have made advances is just amazing. Over the last 50 years, there's been it's really the first time that they began to really evaluate, treatment interventions, preventive interventions, and we've accumulated an enormous amount of knowledge. And so back around probably 2010, I began to feel like I had been blessed to be in a community, Eugene, Oregon, where there were all kinds of contributions made to behavioral science, but more generally, to be in this era, a behavioral scientist, watching all of the things that have developed. And I felt like I wanted to sort of write a memoir of my experience in that community and really emphasize what we have learned. I was on a National Academy of Medicine committee that issued a report in 2009 that summarized what we've learned about prevention, which is a lot. And in fact, one of the conclusions that the committee reached was that if we could make use of all the things we've learned in the last 50 years about prevention, that we could ensure that, if it was widely adopted, that we could ensure that virtually every young person arrived at adulthood with the skills, interests, values, and health habits they need to lead a productive life in caring relationships with other people. And that was what the committee concluded, but I actually wrote that statement. And that's kind of been my mantra. Well, the National Academy reports are usually about that big. And the people say, well, will they influence anybody? I said, well, you can always hit them with the book, I thought I could write something was a little bit more readable. And I think I've been fairly successful at that, given the response, mostly from behavioral scientists who've read it. But it was basically just an effort to bring together what we've learned. And the nurture effect, the idea that nurturing could be, a fundamental aspect of this, it kind of arose from just my analysis of what was working. And so what I've emphasized and what I think is true in the literature is that basically problems develop in environments that are stressful and that fail to reinforce pro-social behavior. So I think of nurturing environments as having four aspects. The first is that they minimize toxic biological and social conditions. And the biological include things like high levels of omega-6 in the diet, which undermines neural development. Also high levels of lead in airborne lead and so on. So there are many physiological things, but there are also socially toxic conditions, and those largely involve aversive behavior that people use to deal with each other. So, for example, in families that are having problems, especially families living in poverty or living in disadvantaged neighborhoods or being discriminated against, that puts stress on the families that makes it more likely that family members will use coercive, aversive behavior to deal with each other. So an example I use is mom says to Johnny, Johnny, it's time to go to bed. And Johnny says, I don't want to go to bed. And mom backs off, right? Well, what just happened? Well, Johnny used his aversive behavior to get mom to back off. He's not going to bed. He's been reinforced. Mom has backed off and Johnny's calmed down. She's reinforced. He's not going to be nasty anymore. And one of the leading people in the research in the last 50 years was Jerry Patterson, who died a couple of years ago. And he was here in Eugene, Oregon. I was honored to know him. And what he did was he went into families that were at high risk for aggressive social behavior. And he studied these patterns of interaction and found that families that were more likely to, raise kids who were aggressive and uncooperative and so on, had high levels of everybody using aversive behavior. People had gotten skilled at that. You're nagging me. I explode, you back off. I just got reinforced. No one's having a good time, but people are coping with each other with aversive behavior. So a child who has become not cooperative and skilled in using aversive behavior gets to school, and what happens? Well, they don't do what the teacher wants, so they don't do well academically, and they're rejected by their peers because they don't get along well with peers. And that puts kids on a trajectory toward adolescent problem behavior, which is a trajectory that leads to the entire range of problems. So one of the things I've stressed in my work is that all these problems of psychological behavioral problems are intertwined, and they all result from the same environmental conditions. So back to nurturing conditions, we need to help families and schools replace nasty aversive behavior with kind, caring behavior. We need to richly reinforce pro-social behavior. And what I mean by richly reinforce, I'm not talking about M&Ms and stickers. I'm talking about listening and caring and respecting and joining kids in what they're doing and so on, to develop all the kinds of things that kids need to develop. But the other thing about nurturing environments is that they need to limit opportunities and influences for problem behavior. Opportunities like kids being left home alone without adult supervision. That's a time when kids are liable to get into problematic behavior. But there are also influences on problem behavior, like the marketing of cigarettes, which, by the way, you Australians have done an excellent job on that. I was actually an expert witness for Australia when it was trying to combat the efforts of the tobacco companies to stop you from doing what you've done. You have had a significant effect on youth smoking, and I congratulate you on that. But anyway, so marketing of cigarettes, marketing of unhealthful food, marketing of alcohol, these are factors that contribute to problem development. And the last aspect of nurturing environments is that they promote they promote psychological flexibility. And if you talk to Steve Hayes, you've probably heard about psychological flexibility. It's basically the ability to live your values, to act on the service of your values, even when your mind tells you that it's hard, that you can't do it. And so I was first exposed to acceptance and commitment therapy long before it was called acceptance and commitment therapy. And as a clinical psychologist, it changed my practices, and it was just really impressive how much better a psychologist I became because of my exposure to acceptance and commitment therapy. But I'm doing all the talking, and I'm not sure that I'm saying things you're particularly interested in. So what do you think?
No, this is exactly where I like to go. Wherever you're passionate about is where this podcast goes, and hearing about these factors are, I think they're certainly standing out for me in terms of that prosocial behaviour, having a kind, compassionate response.
Yep.
The aversive behaviour. The reinforcement is really from an avoidance point of view, which is
yes, exactly
that ACT model, and how do we live in line with being able to actually do that is a very hard thing to do, and that's where that psychological flexibility, I suppose, comes in. Can I ask a little bit about you? You've obviously been in the field some 40 plus years. What did the early days look like? Because you've sort of spoken about this as, in some sense, a bit of a memoir or a summary of your journey through this. What did the early days look like, and how's it kind of evolved to what we know today?
Well, I got my degree in my Ph.D. from the University of Illinois, but it was in social psychology and organizational psychology. It wasn't in clinical psychology. And soon after I got it, I decided that I wanted to get trained in clinical work. So I got an extra year of postdoctoral clinical training and did an internship at the University of Wisconsin. But in the process of that, I came in contact with B.F. Skinner's work. And B.F. Skinner was somebody who, in mainstream psychology said, oh, no, it was rejected by mainstream psychology. And I was a product of mainstream psychology. But I had a colleague at the University of Washington, and I was talking about some work that Stanley Schachter had done on people's behavior. And I can remember him saying, yeah, but Schachter has it all wrong. And so I said, well, what could I read? And they said, well, you could read Skinner's verbal behavior. So I started reading Skinner's verbal behavior, and it didn't make any sense to me. But then I started reading Science and Human Behavior, and I was working on my dissertation at the time. And my dissertation was on the characteristics of academic areas. And I was trying to understand how they differed. And to do that, I did a multidimensional scaling of the characteristics of academic areas. And I found that you could basically characterize any academic area in terms of 3 dimensions. One was whether or not it had a fixed paradigm or it didn't have a paradigm. The second was whether it was biologically oriented, in any sense related to biology or not. And the third was whether it was pure or applied research or study. And what that made me realize was there's a wonderful book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in that book, he argued that the way that scientific revolutions occurred is that somebody comes along and says, no, here's a better way to think about it, and it reorganizes people's thinking. So, for example, Copernicus said that no, the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the Earth went around the sun, and it accounted for a bunch of anomalies that had been observed. Why was this here and that there and so on? And it made sense of them. And it changed. That was a new paradigm. Evolution was a new paradigm. And so I'm reading this, and I also had done this analysis of paradigmatic areas and non-paradigmatic areas in academia. And psychology was in the non-paradigmatic side. And I went, yeah, that's about right. There's all different kinds of people. And so then I'm reading B.F. Skinner's work, and I'm realizing wait a minute, he is saying that every aspect of human behavior can be understood by understanding the context that selects behavior. And so I started getting into that and got deeply into it. And I spent a year at University of Wisconsin reading everything I could find on behavior therapy. I was well educated by the end of my year. But okay, so fast forward. I think I've described how, we began in the 1980s to do randomized trials to test the effects of things. The first randomized trial was done in something like 1949, and there are now been thousands of them done, not just in psychology, but in medicine and other areas. But we began to accumulate a lot of knowledge, and that knowledge was mostly around how individuals and maybe families are affected. But we got to get to everybody. And if you've talked to David Sloan Wilson, have you talked to him since he published Atlas Hugged?
Oh, I don't know. I spoke with him after his recent one, the view of this view of life.
Yes. Well, since then he's published a novel, and it's called Atlas Hugged, and it is it's a response to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. But what he has in there is the hero of this thing starts an organization, and they have jackets, in this movement, and they have a dot, a circle, an American flag, and the world. And the notion is that at every level of society, we need to have that entity working not just for itself, but for the rest of the world. Sound familiar? So the dot is an individual. The circle is a group or organization. The flag is a country, and the world is the whole world. And he's arguing that at every level, we need to have that kind of cooperation. We need to have nurturing environments at every level. We need every entity to be concerned about the well-being, not just of themselves, but of everyone. Well, look at capitalism as it currently stands. It is just a monument to the self-aggrandizement of organizations. It's Milton Friedman's argument that the only business of a corporation should be to maximize its income. Well, that has distorted societies massively, particularly in the United States, but also in many other countries. And so, that's, if you read the second half of The Nurture Effect, I begin to get into the notion that it's not enough to be really good at how I could treat an individual or how I could prevent a family from, raising kids who are aggressive and so on. We need to go up to higher levels of organization. And in particular, we need to reform capitalism, because the version of capitalism we have now is one that has just decimated this country. And is, I did a talk yesterday for the UK, and I've got a graph in my slides that's the relationship between economic inequality and all kinds of problems. And it turns out that the more unequal a country, the more problems you have, health problems, psychological, behavioral problems, and so on. Well, the United States is the highest. We're number one. We're the highest level of economic inequality of any developed country. But the UK is also quite high. And I think Australia's at the higher end. And beware, because if you let this go, it's going to get worse. And so we have to reform society at the higher levels of government, adopting policies that ensure the well-being of every person versus ensuring the well-being of the very wealthy. And so that's why I wrote Rebooting Capitalism, How to Forge a Society That Can Work for Everyone. And I am working on how we can get reforms in every sector of society, where the foundational idea for each entity is that they want to examine the degree to which they're ensuring the well-being of every person. And so, for example, the implications for a corporation are that corporations would be responsible not only for the well-being of investors, but for the well-being of their employees, their customers, and the community as a whole. and which is the B Corp movement, and which I think is worldwide. It's certainly in the United States. So, adopting and promoting those values as opposed to self-aggrandizing values that, say, if I make a lot of money, it must be good, the invisible hand theory. So that's what I'm most excited about. I have created an organization called Values to Action, which is trying to advance these reforms. And we're doing it by creating action circles, small groups of people who could work on a very specific slice of the problem and make a specific contribution to changing the situation. And we're just getting started, but we're working on improving child well-being, on reducing pollution, on reducing economic disparities, on reducing learning disparities, and so on. So, like I said, yeah, go ahead.
Can you talk about some of those areas as to how some of those programs or ideas have come about? I'm assuming a lot of this is data-driven as well, or finding out where some of the inequalities are or pitfalls are. Can you talk us through some of those?
Yeah, I mean, the modus operandi of these action circles are, okay, what's a very specific problem? Why is this a problem? In what way is it a problem? So let's just take, actually, I'll walk you through all of or a number of the ways in which disadvantaged populations are disadvantaged. And so one of the ways is they have under-resourced schools, and those schools are less successful in teaching the things that kids need to know, and they're less successful at helping kids to learn to be cooperative, to have self-regulation, and so on. So right there, we have a tremendous amount of evidence about what is needed to ensure that kids develop successfully, but it's not in widespread use. And most of the effort and I was on another National Academy of Medicine committee in 2019, we're doing an update of the 2009 report. And what we were feeling is, we haven't made much progress. We had all this knowledge in 2009, but getting it out there has been very slow. So the action circles are a way to promote, to accelerate that. So just take academic disparities. In this country, and I'm sure this is the case for Indigenous people in Australia and poorer people in Australia as well, that they're less likely to be successful academically. And one of the foundational things for academic success is the ability to read. In this country, we have about, if you're lucky, 40% of kids are proficient readers by grade 4. And there's a lot of evidence that if you can't read competently by grade 3, you'll never read competently. And that will consign you to a life of poverty, and premature death. And so dealing with these disparities is extremely important. But it's just one slice of what somebody living in but it's a pretty important slice. Well, it turns out that an enormous amount of the research that's been done on academic success, on reading success, was done here in Eugene, Oregon. And so I'm connected with a bunch of people who are good at reading instruction. In fact, I have a meeting tomorrow with a group of them, because what we want to do is design action circles that can work in a particular community, or even, down to a neighborhood, just my kid's school, and create a circle of people, of 5 to 10 people, who would commit to work for maybe just a couple of months to advance what's needed. And we know what's needed. We need more effective instructional practices in schools. We can define them. If a teacher wants to do those, if a school wants to do those, we can tell them how to do it. We have the training materials to do that. So that's one, they're teaching better. But the kids who come to these schools are disadvantaged, and you can't always get the schools to do what works. In fact, there's been resistance to effective reading instruction. Okay, there are other things you can do. We did a randomized trial where we took kids out of class, randomly chose kids who were low in reading skill, and took them out of class and taught them for about half an hour twice a week with supplemental instruction using the best teaching methods. we found that those kids 2 years later were still better on comprehension than the kids who hadn't gotten that program. So if you give them a boost, it can really make a difference.
I think I can vouch for that. My parents migrated from Serbia, and I went to a program which I think many schools in Australia have, which is called ESL, which is English as a Second Language.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it felt awful, getting pulled out of your class to go read with someone, but it was one-on-one tutoring.
Yes.
I had no idea at the time. I just thought, why am I being singled out? But mum and dad couldn't teach me at home how to read English. As a matter of fact, they still struggle as adults, having come here as adults.
Mm-hmm.
But I obviously, am proficient in it. I think that was a major, major boost. And it wasn't for an extended period of time. I can't remember exactly, but I don't believe it was more than 6 or so months that I was probably in the program, maybe less. But
how old were you?
Oh, look, I don't know. I actually think it was done in primary school. So, yeah, look, it's all a blur. So it must have been very early. So it was all a blur, but I just remember how awful it felt. But I have no doubt that I'm a product of having that advantage where, some time, energy, and nurturing was invested into me. That not that my parents didn't sort of love and the like, but they didn't have that capacity to do so, at least at an English level. So I can vouch for what you're saying.
Well, and in fact, the study we did had mostly Hispanic kids, where it was the same kind of issue in terms of many of them, their parents didn't speak much English. So, and you were fortunate to have a school that did that. And, but, what excites me about this is the possibility that we would enable people who are living in disadvantaged communities to kind of take the bull by the horns, not just hope that the school district will, make sure their children learn to read, but actually take steps. So one is getting teachers to get the proper skills. A second is to do supplemental instruction. But it doesn't have to be left to the schools. If a community is really concerned that they want every one of their kids to learn to read, they can do other things. Churches and other organizations, volunteer organizations, can be helped to help kids learn to read. There's a book called How to Teach Your Children to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. And it was written by some people here in Eugene who were developing classroom-based instruction, but they weren't getting as far in, getting people to adopt the instructional techniques as they would. So they just put them in this book for, it's a self-help book for parents. Well, my wife is trained in direct instruction, which is this teaching method. So we have 2 boys, and Georgia brings this copy of this book, How to Teach Your Children to Read. And I did a lot of the, taking the kids through it. And so both of them could read fluently by the time they got to kindergarten. The book works, right? And in fact, my wife and I were asked to take care of the kids when our, my son and daughter-in-law had date night. And so I was asked to read to Grayson when he was about 4 years old. And so I said, what do you want me to read? And he pulls out the very same volume of this book that I used to teach his father to read. I was so touched. And, and I read him a story. But, we can assist whole communities in doing this. We do not have, we can, do go around the schools if need be. And so I'm really excited about that as a possibility, and to use that. So if you do that in a community, in a school, and it works, right? We're trying to design these with a protocol that anybody who wants to create an action circle in their community can do this. So if we're going to have a social movement to change the society, we can take all of the things we know, and we're going to see if we can create action circles that advance those things in every community. We can do the same thing with reducing problematic police activities. We can do it with reducing pollution in neighborhoods of disadvantage. We're doing it with social emotional learning, which is the the other aspect of education is, good programs. And in fact, one of them is the good behavior game, which is now being fairly widely adopted in Australia. And you know about the good behavior game?
No, please explain.
So sometime in the 1960s, there was a teacher in Kansas at the University of Kansas. Her husband is a graduate student at the University of Kansas, which you may know is a place of behavior analysis. So there were third grade classes, and she got one of them. She's a new teacher. She's just come to town. And there were 3 classes, and the other teachers who were there, they assorted the kids into those 3 classes. And guess which kids were in her classroom, right? So by Thanksgiving, she's ready to quit. So her husband says, well, let's go talk to Montrose Wolf, who's one of the behavior analysts in the program. And they talked about it. And he asked, well, are there times when the kids, behave well? And she says, well, if you have a spelling bee, they enjoy that. So somehow they came up with the idea that maybe they could have small groups of kids work together, and they could the team could get a reward if they were, on task and so on. And they showed remarkable changes. And, they had the reading, they were measuring disruptive behavior, and disruptive behavior is, kids going off like this, or, just not paying attention or even being defiant. And so they were tracking that. And so they had it in reading and math, and they started playing the good behavior game just in reading. And guess what? Disruptive behavior went way down. It stayed high in math. Then they tried it in math. It went, it got better there. And eventually it was better throughout the class. So that was 50 years ago. And there are a lot of studies that showed the good behavior game's value. And in fact, a friend of mine, Shep Kellum at Johns Hopkins University, wanted to see if it could affect at-risk kids in terms of their life trajectory. And so he introduced it in a group of first and second grade classrooms, and randomly assigned, it was a random assignment of kids to classrooms and to conditions and so on. Well, the group that got the good behavior game, just in first and second grade, were significantly less likely to develop ADHD. They were significantly more likely to, less likely to be arrested when they were in middle school, less likely to drop out of school, more likely to attend college, less likely to have problems, as young adults, less likely to have problems with substance use, antisocial behavior, suicidal behavior. And in fact, there's a study just coming out that followed that group into adulthood. They're more likely to vote. They got the good behavior game. There's been an analysis of the return on investment for this. It showed that every dollar that's invested in the good behavior game produces a return on investment of about $64. Now, if you could get that kind of return on investment, you wouldn't be talking to me. You'd be off, I don't know what you'd do with your money. Hopefully it would be a good thing. You could send some of it to Values to Action. But that return on investment was because the healthcare costs were reduced. The amount of money that kids earned when they became adults was greater. The criminal justice costs were much lower. There were all kinds of benefits. And so a friend of mine subsequently developed a way to organize and promote the good behavior game. And that's the one that's being done in Australia. And I will tell you, I helped to implement it in some elementary schools here in Oregon. We just did it. We started with some of the grades and some of the in 3 elementary schools. And by the end of the year, all the teachers wanted to do it in those schools. And by 3 years into it, 6 of the 7 school districts in this one county we were working had adopted the good behavior game. It's just a beautiful thing to see.
And is it as simple, and my apologies, I'm not sure if I'm capturing this completely, is it as simple as assisting kids to behave not on an individual basis, but as a group? So they learn from each other as a group. Exactly. They sort of identify with one another, and that therefore there's more leverage for them to be rewarded or and miss out as a group, and
As a
so
group.
there's a cohesiveness there that keeps everyone in line, keeps everyone focused, keeps everyone attentive on the same goal. It effectively works in that sort of.
It's very much what David Sloan Wilson talks about in terms of selection at the group level, because that's exactly what it is. And in fact, when I first visited David Sloan Wilson in Binghamton, we're sitting in his living room and we're talking about this stuff, and I start telling him about Dennis Embry's work with the good behavior game, and we got him on a cell phone, and I introduced them, and so David likes to say that, if you remember the movie The Three Amigos, there are actually four amigos. Well, David and Steve and Dennis and I published a paper, sort of putting all this together. But you mentioned, how do you get kids to work together? Yes, you reward them for cooperation, and suddenly, if you're the cut up, the guy who's always disruptive, but we're always laughing because you were so amused by what you're doing, right? The teacher's ready to kill you, but and so this rearranges the contingencies, because suddenly I have a stake that you're not being disruptive, because we're all going to get to an extra 5 minutes of recess or something like that. And so Dennis likes to talk about, the notion of, okay, teach, how frequently could you praise positive behavior in classroom? If you did it once a minute, all day long, right? Okay, here's the amount of reinforcement the kids get for that behavior, right? How many kids are in your class? 25, right? And what are they reinforcing, right? And you're outnumbered, right? If you don't recruit the reinforcement of those kids in the class, you're going to have some serious problems. And so, but what Dennis has done is he's devised all of these clever ways to make this happen. So he starts with what's called Pax Vision. Pax means peace, health, happiness, and productivity. It's the positive stuff. And he has the kids say, if this were the most wonderful classroom you could ever imagine being in, what would you see more of? What would you hear more of? What would you do more of? And what would you feel more of? And so he has a poster, and they make a list of all the things they'd like to see. The kids are participating. This isn't the teacher saying, here's what you need to do. The kids are saying they want to do this. Oh, and what would you like to see, hear, feel, and do less of? And he calls those spleens. Spleens is a made-up word because he's trying to take the venom and the anger out of disruptive behavior. And so, a teacher is really successful if at some point she does something or he does something, and one of the kids says, "Hey, teacher, that's a spleen." And the teacher goes, "Yeah, you're right. I need to do less of that." So it's not, you should be ashamed of yourself or you're bad or stupid, but simply, yeah, we all spleen, and we're trying to do less of that and trying to do more of this. So then you've got this. The kids have described that, but they don't want you to simply put that up on the wall and have it be forgotten. You can use that every day. Kids, we're going to do 15 minutes of silent reading, and what would be some packs that we'd like to see? And the kids are raising their hand and say, they're making a social commitment in front of others to what they want to do. We published a paper where we took all of these, what are called kernels, Pax Vision, and all the other things we do, and described how it could be used in families and how it could be used in workplaces and other settings. It's basically the basic things for making nurturing environments. So how am I doing on action circles?
No, lovely. I'm just listening in awe. I'm sure our listeners will be doing exactly the same. Hearing about how these things come together. It just sounds. I'm sort of as you're speaking, thinking about some of these social things that have been really successful here in Australia, and one of those is around littering. Australia has incredible compliance, and I think we're culturally really good about not littering, and it's because we look down on it. Where if I go into four-wheel drive group that I'm a part of that goes, we go through the bush. There's always comments about people saying, went to this campsite and people had left their trash. We've picked it up, and other people are saying, well done, thanks for picking it up. And, we found this, and everyone's looking down at everyone. There's a advertising campaign in Australia, which says, don't be a tosser. And it effectively has, someone driving in their vehicle throwing something out of the window, and, they call him a tosser. And because it's a bit catchy and it's very Aussie. There's a current one. I actually just saw it last night. I don't think it's going to stick, but it was effectively saying that, if you drink drive, you're a prick. And it's a bit harsher, and I was saying to my wife, gosh, I can't believe we're at this stage in life where we're kind of labeling people this way, but clearly they're trying different things. And so, rather than sort of criticizing them, it's like there's some really good social things that they're trying to find what's the glue, and if you find that little word like a spleen or, like a tosser or whatever the language, it sticks. And, clearly we've done some incredible things, as you say, from a health perspective in smoking. It's becoming antisocial. No one wants to leave the group, go out of a restaurant, to go outside 25 meters now, or whatever the number is. You got to go away from the front door. You kind of become isolated. So everyone, even people that have been smoking their whole lives are reducing the number of cigarettes, which, it's not only just about people not smoking or people stopping. It's great reduction. And obviously the cost has become phenomenal.
I have here. Yes, here. I got to show you this.
Little black book that you're grabbing. What is that?
This is a pack of cigarettes from Australia, and as you can see, this is a man who died of cancer, and there's more, and these are the packages, and all the cigarettes have to be sold this way. And it does say, it'll have the brand name there, tiny thing. And I actually was an expert in lawsuit, in the federal lawsuit in this country against the tobacco the tobacco industry. And that, which is why Australia asked me to help with this. But I hadn't really studied the research on these kinds of packages. This has a significant impact in reducing people smoking, and you guys are way out ahead of everybody.
I believe we've taken it one step further now. That was for a good long period. At some stage, I think they actually even removed all packaging, so it had to be plain. So you couldn't go out and have brand versus brand recognition. And even in like where they're sold, service stations, grocery shops, they're all behind a counter, but they actually have to be covered as well. So it's almost like a garage, you have to lift up this big, garage sort of door to reveal them. So they're out of sight. No one can see them anymore. And there's just so many good things, not to mention there's a very strong economic forcing factor. They're now like, $50 a packet or something absurd. So we've done an exceptional job.
You have, and actually that reminds me that one of the other things that I think is really important for how we can create a societies that work for everyone is the public health perspective. And, the history of much of psychology and behavioral science has been focused on individual behavior and how you change individual behavior. And we've gotten better, as we've just discussed, in how to help groups, cooperate and work together and so on. But the public health perspective is very simple. It's simply, let's pay attention to the incidence and prevalence of disease. And it started out with the plague in Europe, where a third of the people died when the plague hit Europe in the 14th century. And what happened was that they began to count how many people had died and how many people were infected and so on. And so they're starting to pay attention to the incidence and prevalence of disease and so on. But now, it's clear you can apply that to any problem. With COVID-19, certainly. But you can also apply it to the incidence of kids starting to smoke or the prevalence of people smoking. And your public health people and those in our country are looking at, how can we get the percent of people who are smoking? But the same thing is true of positive things. What percent of the people are respectful, are nurturing, are kind? Here in Eugene, we have a kindness campaign. We're trying to increase the degree to which people are being kind. And the reason that that's important is that, we can show you that we can do a really good job if we have control of a school or we can help families, we can help schools and so on. But it's not good enough unless you're increasing the incidence of people who are, behaving with pro-social values and norms and so on, and reducing the incidence of antisocial behavior. So the public health perspective is a critical part of what we need to do to change our societies.
What are some things that we can do? I know in Australia at the moment, there's a campaign for bowel cancer screening. There's ads going on where, because the difficulty that we have is that the test itself is not very pleasant. So my understanding is you're supposed to take a swab I suppose, press it on your own feces and then, put it in its container and send it off. And a lot of people don't like doing that. There's an natural avoidance to doing so. But there's a big campaign trying to push people because if it's caught early, it's extremely preventable. It's treatable.
Colon cancer?
Colon cancer, that's right. Colon cancer. So what are the sorts of things that communities can do, or policy changes that can support how to do health on that broader level at that national or even international level?
Well, you can do it at the national level, but I think in some ways it needs to get down to the community level. And so in this country, we're making some progress on that. But for example, in the state of Oregon, you can get measures of the percent of the population that have addictive disorders, alcohol, other drugs, and so on, which is a very substantial problem in this country and in our state. But you really got to get down to the community level. And so one of the things I've been pushing in this state is that we have an assessment system, and there are good ones for adolescents that could assess the proportion of kids who are binge drinking, the proportion of kids who are drinking at all, and all of the things related to drinking and smoking and antisocial behavior. And we need to monitor those at the level of the community. There's some research that shows that if you're in a work organization and you put a chart on the wall of a behavior you want to see more of, just putting the chart on the wall actually can motivate people to change their behavior. Well, I submit that every community needs a chart on the wall of the well-being of the population, and that we need to have people participating and ensuring that, the whole population is doing better. We have an enormous way to go in this country, and I suspect there's plenty to be done in Australia. It's again a public health orientation and a commitment to the well-being of every person. And that's something that, there's been huge division in this country. It has been, it is largely the result of advocacy for free market economics. You might not think that has a lot to do with the divisions, but the success of the conservative billionaire coalition, which I write about in Rebooting Capitalism, was largely because they were able to convince poor whites to vote against their own interests, but to ensure that they would be better off than black people. It was subtly and not so subtly a racist effort, which Trump took advantage of and amplified greatly. And we're going to see if we can get away from that. I think Biden's doing a good job of moving the discussion to how we can, better benefit everyone.
I ask a broader question.
Yeah.
And I appreciate there might not be a clear answer because it's going to be a big question. Clearly, capitalism in its current form has some inherent problems.
Right.
It is a forcing factor toward individualism.
Yes.
And you're talking about communities, pro-social behaviour, groups, and the stickiness of being part of something that is values based at a smaller level. What is that transition? How do we move? What are your thoughts about what does the new capitalism need to look like? How do we do that? Because this personal sort of individual interest sort of space is so inherent, entwined. It's part of our fabric. I imagine it's the same in the US as it is here in Australia, where we've got fences between houses. Everyone's got an apportioned lot. If you can afford to buy a portioned lot of land to live on, or you rent your little land, it's so bound up in the battle of the fittest, so to speak.
Yes. Oh, it's evolutionary, right? Well, I think it has to be top down and bottom up, and I think we need a social movement. In the first half of the 20th century, there was a social movement in this country to and in many other countries, to reduce the inequalities that existed. We had as great economic inequality at the turn of the century, from 1900, as we do now. And we got better and better. I think the Depression had something to do with it. I think the Second World War had something to do with it. It brought people together with unity, but there was a social movement in this country that, there were most of the major civic organizations that exist in this country, the Rotary clubs, the Girl Scouts, the PTA, the American Civil Liberties Union, all of these different organizations were developed in the first 30 years of the 20th century. And they were all speaking to the needs of people. And most of them developed from local. The Rotary Club started with some clubs here, and it spread. And so there was a continuing movement toward we and not I. Robert Putnam has a new book out called Upswing. I reviewed it in medium.com. If you go to medium.com, you can get a short course on that book. But basically what he showed was that the unity was growing and growing and growing. And then in the 1960s, it began to fall apart. And it was partly due to the war in Vietnam. It was partly due to the sexual revolution. And there was a lot of anti-business sentiment. There were 1,900 bombings of businesses in the United States in 1970. And so the business community got really worried, and they said, we got to promote business. And that's how the Conservative Billionaire Coalition got started. A memo written by Lewis Powell, who became a member of the Supreme Court, he wrote this fairly, intelligent memo about why this was happening and what they needed to do. And it prompted the organization and advocacy and for free market economics. And you can see the effect that this had, because when it got started, by the 1980s, incoming freshmen in colleges who had been surveyed every year about what their values were, it kind of flipped, and more kids said when they want to become rich and famous than said they wanted to grow as a person and contribute to their community. So these are competing values. And by the way, there's a fair amount of evidence that people who are oriented toward, I want to be rich, I want to be famous, have greater psychological problems. They have relationship problems, it's not a positive thing. But of course, if you're promoting economic competition, you're also creating a society where people do feel threatened and have reason to feel threatened. And so that actually increases the degree to which they want to be rich, they want to be famous. And so it's a self-producing thing. So movements that are trying to encourage cooperation, kindness, and those kinds of things are at the you start at the bottom up. You're working in schools, you're working in families, you're working in neighborhoods to get people to be more cooperative and caring. That's part of a social movement we need, but we also need state level, province level, national level policies that, for example, reduce economic inequality, reduce poverty, and so on. So we need to do both of those. And that's why, David Sloan-Whiston has the individual, the group, the country, the world. We need to select practices that benefit everyone at every one of those levels. And so, I basically what I'm committed to, and I'm in a network that's connected with David and Dennis Embry and Steve Hayes and the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, which has met in Australia. It was the last time I was there in Australia. There are thousands and thousands of people and hundreds of organizations that are pretty much on the same page about what people need and how we can get there. And we just need to get better and better at that. What you are doing, and I, looked at all the people you're connecting with, I want them all in the same group. I want everybody to know that other people are doing this and to support it. And that's why we need to build coalitions of all of these organizations. So, I'm going to count you and everybody you're connected with as one other node that I've, thanks to you, I've gotten connected with, and we need to be working together to do all of this. And so if we do, I think two things can happen if we do. One is that we can actually change these problems. We can change them one at a time, and this kid gets better and so on. But we can also engage people in activity that is meaningful. And if you listen to Steve Hayes, you know how important meaning is in life and how you can have a meaningful life, even in the context of very difficult situations. And so what we're trying to do with these action circles, I've got, so far, I'm just getting started. We got about 120 people who've joined Values to Action. You can join Values to Action at valuestoaction.com, and they become part of a movement. They become part of a movement that is making their life in part about what you can do. When I give talks to people, the first thing I do is ask them questions. Are you satisfied with the state of the world? No, I don't get many people who say yes. Are you unsure what you can do to make a difference about it? Yes. And are you also concerned that you don't have the time to take away from your job and your family and even your recreational activities to become a full-time activist living in poverty trying to make a difference in the world? But suppose we could get you in contact with 5 to 10 other people who are clear about what they're trying to do. It's a specific thing. It may not be dealing with everything, but it's dealing with this problem. And you are therefore a part of a larger society that's all these people trying to do these things. I think one of the issues that I've encountered with, I'm connected with about 6 behavioral science organizations. Pro-Social World is one, Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, Society for Behavioral Medicine, National Prevention Science Coalition. And so one of the things that's possible is that people can feel good about what they're doing because they're connected with other people who are trying to make a difference, kind and caring people who are living their lives according to the principles that David is promoting in Pro-Social World. So, and Paul Atkins, by the way, is You know Paul?
Yeah, he's probably a kilometre away. So yeah, I definitely know. Well, he's been on the
Well, tell
podcast.
him I said hi.
I will. I will. There's obviously a lot of optimism in this space. There's still a lot of hurdles. You speak very optimistically about this space, this possibility of change. Do you really think it's possible?
Oh, I absolutely think it's possible. I mean, look at the empirical evidence. Read the Nurture Effect or the or the National Academy report. It's absolutely possible. Every time you do a randomized trial and show that this intervention worked, that demonstrates the possibility. The problem we have now is how do we escalate that to, affecting whole populations? And we're making a lot of progress on that. Matt Sanders, have you had Matt Sanders on?
No, I haven't. I will now.
You know about triple P? Well, Matt Sanders, do you know who he is?
No, please.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, Matt Sanders is a psychologist, and he's at the University of Queensland, right? Okay. So he was sometime in the late 70s, I think. He was on a visit to Stanford University, and he was learning about the heart disease prevention program that they were doing. So here were a bunch of people concerned about cardiovascular disease, and they were trying to do a public health campaign, affect the population of people rather than just treat everybody who has the disease. Theme I've mentioned before. And so he was a behavioral psychologist working with families, and he said, hey, these public health principles are relevant to family interventions as well. So he was the first person to actually start to try to translate what we'd learned about family interventions into public health campaigns. And he's done it, and he's all over the world. I mean, he's a must for your podcast, and you can tell him I said that. Because what he figured out was, well, most people don't want to come for a 10-session, program so they can, get their kid to be less aggressive. But we could have these tip sheets, and he's got about 40 tip sheets. So here are all the common problems you have with young children, right? Won't go to bed, wets the bed, tantrums in the supermarket, just a few, right? Okay. Here's what you can do about this. And so he set these up, and then he's enabled people in the community who run into parents of young children, in this case, and teaches them how to just say, here's some suggestions for what you could do. Why don't you give this a try and let me know how it goes? So they're providing some social support and some social influence to try, what you can do. And he's got all kinds of videos, and he's now online doing this stuff, and he's affecting the prevalence of problems in communities. So he teams up with Ron Prince, who's a friend of mine at the University of South Carolina. They've got 18 counties, and they randomly assign half of them to get triple P, the positive parenting program, and the other half don't, right? And they're focused on young children. And 2 years later, there were significant differences in the rate of child abuse, hospital-reported child abuse. They've changed the population. So yes, we can. We can do it.
So Matt developed the Triple P program.
Say it again?
So Matt developed the Triple P program, because then I do know.
Good.
Yeah, well, that's how prevalent his work is. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, look, I asked the question in a bit of a cheeky way, because I am a massive optimist. I actually think what we've done so far is phenomenal, and historically, things just get better and better and better. But I think we run into more and more complex challenges, and as it becomes a more global conversation, it's a harder, more complex question. And so I like the idea that you say, let's start at the community, the things that you and I can do, to get others involved, because we need a lot of foot soldiers, so to speak, all promoting, pro-social in whatever cause is meaningful and important to them. I know my wife, she advocated for a playground last several years, and she was able to achieve that, and that's going to improve and affect our whole community for years, in actual fact, for probably decades. So when someone becomes passionate, big things can happen.
Indeed.
Tony, I could speak with you forever. I wish we had another 15 hours to chat and a few more coffees, but I will let you go. But is there anything else you wanted to add before we finish?
As a practical matter, if people want to, help me and help the society, they could go to valuestaaction.com and join. $47, and we're building. I'm also interested in all the people you've talked to, and that network of people. And I imagine you have all of those people, so you might be hearing from me about that, because I'm trying to promote values to action because I can do these things. I'm not trying to get rich. I'm already, actually, capitalism has been pretty good to me. I'm putting the money into values to action, but I want to connect people and hopefully show that this can be one way, not the only way, but one way of contributing to the change that we so badly need. So I appreciate your asking me to be on this, and I've enjoyed it.
No, I think it's a great cause, and the work that you speak of is phenomenal. And I think it's important to also mention, for listeners to go out and consider getting the book, the nurture effect, to I suppose be inspired, be motivated, be excited about what's possible, and to see real world change occurring. Data, science driven, and then values to action to start doing something on the ground. The truth is, I think it makes us all feel a lot more satisfied and warm at heart and fulfilled. So I think what you're doing is amazing. And I really appreciate you coming onto the show and spending that time explaining. And please send me any other contacts that I can get in contact with to have on the show, because this is one way, at least for me, that I can contribute, and is very fulfilling for me, not only on an intellectual basis, but also knowing that there are lots of listeners out there that will be inspired and to have the likes of yourself to share that knowledge is muchly appreciated. So thank you, Tony.
Well, and do send me a link when you have this, and I'll spread the word.
Absolutely. When we post it up, you'll get a reminder. So good. Thanks again, Tony. Have a good afternoon there, and I'll start the day here. So take care, and appreciate it again.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.